Welcome to Tales from South Florida. I'm your host, Bill Monty. I'm recording this the week of the Democratic National Convention, and it seems apropos that this week's episode should take a look back in time to something extraordinary that happened connected to political conventions and South Florida. Stick around for Miami Beach and the 1972 political conventions. Cue the music.
Let's take a talk down memory lane, 'cause the stories around here are just insane. Pirates World, the Sporto and Wolfies too, Palm Beach to Key West, that's where we grew. These are the tales from South Florida for you, with your host Bill Monty.
Now, it's a foregone conclusion that in this week's Democratic convention held up in Chicago, Vice President Kamala Harris will be the nominee. If not, that will be the biggest political upset in American history. But it made me think, it was over 50 years ago, both the Democratic and Republican conventions were held at the convention center down in Miami Beach. Hadn't been done before in the same city, hasn't been done since. And it was really an incredible time. So we're going to do a little time flip for you here. I was a child when all this was going on. In 1968, the Democratic National Convention was held in Chicago, and what happened there was famous. It was turning America on its head. It was the establishment versus the hippies. Out of that spawned the famous Chicago 8, then the Chicago 7 trial. It was Dan Rather on the floor of the convention getting manhandled and pushed around by the Chicago Police Department and the thugs of the mayor. It seemed like everything was coming apart at the seams. Shouldn't come as any surprise that the winner of the election that year was not the Democratic candidate Hubert Humphrey, but was indeed Richard Nixon. We'll move forward 4 years later, and we are now in the heart of protests throughout the country. College campuses are being taken over by protesters. Hippies are everywhere. Drugs are running rampant. Free love. Woodstock had happened a couple of years before. As a matter of fact, right now, I think was 50 some odd years ago, the anniversary of Woodstock as I'm recording this. Into all of this comes first the Democratic convention and then the Republican convention down to Miami Beach. I don't know why it was decided that both would be held here, but it was. They certainly weren't going back to Chicago, I don't think, for any conventions at that time. So the Democrat convention happened in July of 1972 and the Republican in August of 1972. So one of the things is the Miami Beach Convention Center was historic. On one side of it was where they filmed the Jackie Gleason television show, and so it was famous for that. Miami Beach was still very much considered a place of retirement. Older people, usually older Jewish people, went there to retire. That's kind of what went there. The younger crowd was going to Fort Lauderdale, spring break and all that. The older crowd was hanging out down in the delis of Miami Beach. The Miami Beach Convention Center was constructed back in 1956. It opened in October of 1958. The original name was the Miami Barbecue Beach Exhibition Hall. I like that name. Sorry they got rid of that. Later renamed the Miami Beach Exhibition Hall, and was the largest exhibition center in the South at the time with over 100,000 square feet of space. The convention center had some notable things happen there. One, in 1964, Muhammad Ali, then known as Cassius Clay, defeated Sonny Liston in Hall C to win his first World Heavyweight Championship. This fight was a politically charged spectacle held during the heat of the Civil Rights Movement and is considered one of the most iconic moments in sports history. In 1971, the first auto show was held at the Miami Beach Convention Center. In 1968, the year the Democrats were in Chicago, the Republican National Convention was held at the Convention Center. In 2002, the first annual Art Basel Miami Beach was held. But it was 1972 that saw both the Republican and Democratic National Conventions held at the Convention Center only a month apart. My family, my mother was probably the biggest Democrat I've ever met in my life. She loved John Kennedy. She hated Richard Nixon. She was very politically activated. I think the reason that I grew up knowing so much was that we always had the news on, and my mother always took the time to tell me about what was going on. So she was very excited that this was happening and saw it as an opportunity for us to learn, both me and my brother, and be a part of the conventions. Not to go there per se to actively be a part while things were going on, but at least to go down and experience what it was like to have that here. My father, although he never actually admitted it, his omission was the admission, was a supporter of Richard Nixon. So that could explain some things in my parents' marriage. My dad would never come out and say it, but he certainly never denied it, and he certainly never said a bad thing about Richard Nixon, which my mother said every bad thing about Richard Nixon. No one was happier in this country about Watergate than my mother, I can tell you that. So I do remember that we drove down, I guess it was on the weekend, to the convention, and just to see what was going on and to kind of take it all in. And it was really exciting. So we lived in Hollywood, so going down to Miami Beach anyway, that was kind of like an excursion for us, And going down there, we saw the protests going on. Now, there were protests that happened during the Democratic Convention, if I recall correctly, but they were pretty mild compared to what was going on at the Republican Convention. It wasn't as bad as Chicago, but Nixon was president. He was running for re-election. If you were young and a hippie or of the anti-war movement, you believed Richard Nixon was single-handedly responsible for the Vietnam War. That's not 100% accurate, but that was the feeling in the country at the time. So when we drove down that day, we saw real hippies. Yes, I saw hippies growing up. The kids in school, I was in high school at the time, so the seniors especially had the long hair, the headbands. Many of them had mustaches, some of the guys too. And you would see them if you went to the malls and stuff, but they weren't all over the place. Movies at the time would make you think hippies were everywhere you went and everywhere you looked. There was a hippie smoking pot and somewhere around. It wasn't really true. But going down to the convention center that day, those were hippies. The tents were set up. The hippies were out, the bell-bottoms, the girls in the midriffs, the smell of pot was in the air. And it was an angry situation. There was chanting going on. The signs were held up. I thought it was so exciting. And my father did not approve of any of it. He thought it was very un-American what was going on. And I honestly don't remember what my brother thought. But my mom was like, see, this is democracy in action. They're talking. This is what you have to do. You have to be active. You have to stand up for what you believe, even if the odds are against you. As we move into this upcoming election and this week of the Democratic Convention, and our country is maybe even more divided right now than it was back in 1972. Having lived through it, I'm going to say the only thing you don't have right now are the protests in the streets and the chanting and the fights and the mobs in Washington outside the White House and everything else. And that's what scares me most about this election, not trying to get political here, is that I feel that this is more of a silent division. People aren't speaking up as much. And that's even a little scarier. At least if someone said something back then, you could confront them, you could talk about it, but it rarely ended in violence unless somehow the police got involved like what happened in Chicago. So I hope that this is the beginning of healing for our country, no matter what happens, no matter who wins the presidential election. I hope that we begin to heal and to move forward, because that is what happened back in 1972 and the years that followed. Yes, because of Watergate, Nixon was forced to resign. A little history lesson for you kids. Gerald Ford became president, and when Jimmy Carter became president, the healing of the country began. And we started talking again. It started unraveling a little bit during the Clinton administration, I know, and now we're where we are, for better or for worse. And it doesn't have to be that way. But I do remember those times back in South Florida, out in front of the Miami Beach Convention Center. And as I got older, I would think back on those. And as I was in my 20s, I always thought, I missed the revolution by about 3 or 4 years. And I did. But on that one day, in August of 1972, I did get to experience it. I did get to be a part of one of the tales from South Florida. What about you, my friends? Do you have any specific memories about the conventions back in 1972, or the times, the hippies and everything that was going on during that time and what it was like down here. Didn't even talk about Grinnell's Park because not really part of this conversation, but that is a conversation for a future episode. Remember, you can always just hit that little comment tab right at the bottom wherever you're listening to this from, whatever app you're listening to it from, and you can text me a message, leave me a comment, or you can email me at talesfromsouthflorida@gmail.com, talesfromsouthflorida@gmail.com. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Tales from South Florida. Just a reminder to please hit that like button, share this with your friends and family, leave me a comment, subscribe. I appreciate it if you do. And a reminder to check out my other podcast, Bill Monty's Guide for Getting Older. It's about me at my age and talking about what it's like to grow older in America and offering hopefully some good advice for those who have some issues with it or are experiencing some problems, but mostly just to have a conversation. My other podcast is brand new, and it's available only on Spotify and YouTube right now. It's called America 451, and that's where I do get political, and I don't hold anything back. So if you're more of a political bent, please go ahead and give America 451 a try. If you have a parent that you're taking care of or you're aging yourself and wondering how things are going to be, I hope you'll give Bill Monty's Guide for Getting Older a try. And I hope that you'll join me again where we take another talk down memory lane, exploring the tales from South Florida. Until then, be safe and be kind.
Let's take a talk down memory lane, 'cause the stories around here are just insane. Pirates World, the Sporto and Wolfies too. Palm Beach to Key West, that's where we grew. These are the tales from South Florida for you. With your host, Bill Monty.